In this presentation, I'd like to discuss carbon-14. So the title, Do You Have a Date with Carbon-14? The first thing is looking at carbon-14 itself, how it is formed and what happens to it. High in the atmosphere, way up there, solar wind batters around molecules in the air, and nitrogen is struck by high-energy neutrons that are flying around like billiard balls. And so what happens then is there is the neutron striking the nitrogen atom, and it sticks and then kicks out a proton, so that there is a change in the number of protons, and this is what changes nitrogen to carbon, because the number of protons changes from 7 for nitrogen to 6 for carbon. But the number of neutrons changes from 7 to 8, so the total mass is 14, so that's why it's called carbon-14, rather than carbon-12, which is the more frequent form of carbon. So now that is how carbon-14 is formed high up in the atmosphere. Well, it is unstable, and so it decays. We call it radioactive. And so what happens then is with time, and this has been evaluated and shown to be about 5,730 years, that half of that original amount of carbon-14 will decay, and after an additional 5,730 years, only a quarter of the original amount will remain, and after an additional 5,730 years, an eighth, and so this progresses on and on until the amount of the carbon-14 that remains from the original amount in the specimen becomes so low that it ceases to be measurable. It's still there, but in such small amounts we can't measure it, and that occurs at 80 to 100,000 years. But when I give these numbers of years, I have to say repeatedly that these are using the evolutionary assumptions of uniformitarianism, that all physical processes that we observe today have always been going on in the past at the same rate at which we observe them today. So I have to keep making that caveat that is the basis, one of the bases of this system of dating. And so that carbon-14 that is formed high in the atmosphere can combine with oxygen atoms and form carbon dioxide that contains the carbon-14 instead of the usual carbon-12. And so that carbon dioxide is then assimilated by plants into the structures of the plants, into the leaves and the other parts of the plants, and then animals eat them, or we eat them, and we assimilate the carbon-14 into our bodies. Chemically, the other atoms see it as carbon, and they don't particularly care whether it's carbon-12 or 14. And so you see here photosynthesis, that carbon is combined, carbon dioxide is combined with water to form sugars, and this is the basis of photosynthesis and converting the energy from sunlight into energy that we can capture in chemical form in plants and then subsequently in animals. And so the plants take in the water, they take in the carbon dioxide, they form the sugars, and they give off the oxygen which we need to breathe. So it's a very important mutually beneficial cycle between plants and animals. Well, this goes on during life, and so during life the animals and plants absorb carbon-14 into their structures in a equilibrium with the amount of carbon-14 that is in the atmosphere, in the environment. But upon death, then of course the animal or plant ceases to take in more carbon-14, and so that steady state is disrupted, and what's in the organism that is now dead continues to decay with no replacement from new carbon-14 coming in. And so the ratio of the amount of carbon-14 and the amount of carbon-12 is used to determine the age of that dead organism, how long it's been dead, with several assumptions that we'll get to in a few moments. And so then after approximately 80,000 years, maybe with supersensitive equipment, 100,000 years, using the evolutionary assumptions I have to keep saying, there should be no measurable amount of carbon-14. Rocks and fossils that are supposed to be older than this age should be carbon-14 free or dead. In other words, not having any that we can measure. But carbon-14 is actually found in anything and everywhere that has carbon in it. And it cannot be attributed to contamination or background noise, which is what the first attempt to dismiss this was made by evolutionists. But we know with more aggressive investigation that this carbon-14 is inherent, that it really belongs there. So we use carbon-14 to date once living plants and animals, and that would be including things like wood, charcoal, natural gas, eggshells, coral, bone shells, fossils, and coal. And then in rock, carbon-containing rock, marble, graphite, calcite, limestone, and especially diamonds. Well, talking about coal and diamonds, the question arises, how did coal form? And the evolutionary story is been given in the past is that in the swamps of primordial time, trees would fall over, plants would fall over, they'd sit soggy in the water, and eventually over a long period of time would be covered by silt and other dead material, and over tremendous amounts of time would be buried, and then heat and pressure would compress this once living material into coal. But the problem with this is things that just sit there waiting to be buried either get eaten or they decay. They don't wait for thousands of years to be buried. And we know this with this example of the examples of these polystrate trees, poly meaning many and straight from strata meaning layer, many layers, that these trees are found upright, buried in material that hardened into rock, and the evolutionists tell us that these layers of rock represent many thousands of years. So we're supposed to suppose that these trees stood there waiting to be buried for thousands of years before either decomposing or something coming along and eating them. And that's just simply not tenable. So these trees themselves collapse these thousands of years in the layers in which they are found into a catastrophic event. So how long ago did coal form? Well, we are told by the evolutionary model that somewhere between 300,000 to 360,000 years ago, called the Carboniferous period, and that this source of this information is given to you in this book, Diamond Deposits, so it's not just me saying this, this is what the evolutionists say. Well, at Penn State University, there is a national coal bank in which specimens very carefully obtained and immediately put into argon environments and put into these canisters and then refrigerated and sealed so that these specimens will not be altered by oxidation or by anything else in the air, and so that they can be available for subsequent studies and see what investigations are going to be done in the future. So the question is, in these specimens, should there be any carbon-14 in these coal specimens that are supposedly from hundreds of millions of years ago? And the answer is no. And so evolutionists have assumed, because of the age that they assume, that there would be no measurable amount of carbon-14 in these specimens and have not done the experiments. But creationists said, well, let's take a look and see what actual experimentation develops. Here's a picture of a mass spectrophotometer in which samples are put in and carbon-12 and carbon-14 are measured. And so the data shows that these various locations for the coal mines, the names of the seam, and their supposed geological ages by evolutionary assumption, and then the actual measured amounts of carbon-14 found in these specimens, and there are significant amounts of carbon-14 in them. This is not contamination. And so it is the situation that these cannot be hundreds of millions of years old, 300 to 360 million years old. They have to be less than, even using evolutionary assumptions, less than 80 or so thousand years ago. Well, the complaint then could be lodged by evolutionists that coal is soft and somehow things were washed in and out of the coal, so that may have altered the ratio of carbon-12 and 14 and not be reliable data. So then creationists turned to diamonds and said, well, these are the hardest known substances known to man that are natural, and so let's take a look and see how much carbon-14 is found in diamonds. Well, we are told by the evolutionists that diamonds formed deep in the crust of the Earth here. So you see the crust of the Earth in this diagram here, and that as plates, tectonic plates moved around in the past, and everybody agrees that they did, we just disagree on how long ago and how fast they moved, that with these breaks in the crust where we have increased volcanic activity and increased earthquake activity, we know that indeed these things have been moving around. And there are certain locations in which these vents called diamond pipes produce diamonds, and that this material came from deep in the crust and were thrust up at high speeds. It's been calculated that these ores containing the diamond were moving at 20 to 30 kilometers per hour. This is quite amazing speed. So how long ago do evolutionists assume that carbon-14, or actually I should say diamonds, were formed? And according to their outlook, from just under 1 billion to over 3.3 billion years ago from these diamond pipes. And again, the same source for this information. Here is a map of the world showing the diamond producing countries, and it's interesting to me that they form two belts well away from each other, one in the northern hemisphere and one in the southern hemisphere. Now, these beautiful gemstone quality stones are not what were used for research, but rather these industrial grade diamonds that you can see here are quite small and inexpensive. So should there be carbon-14 in diamonds today according to evolution? And the answer, of course, is no, because of the presupposed age of 1 to 3 billion years. So again, here we use the mass spectrophotometer, and the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 atoms is noted here. It's extremely large ratio of 12 to 14. And so here are the countries listed of the source of these diamonds, the name of the locations, and again, there is significant amount of carbon-14 found in these specimens. This is not contamination. So here we have both carbon-14 in coal and in diamonds, and these numbers translate into a much smaller number of years, 44 to 57,000, but still based on several evolutionary assumptions. So let's take a look at these assumptions and see what they are. The first one I want to deal with is uniformitarianism, which is this doctrine that everything that we observe today in terms of physical processes has always been going on at the same rate in the past at which we observe today. And that this ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere has always been the same in the past as it is measured today. Well, we have actual evidence that that has not been the case. In the year 1908 in Siberia, the Tunguska River basin, a large meteor exploded low in the atmosphere and devastated, flattening a huge area of forest. Fortunately, that was a unoccupied area and no reported lives lost, which is, we're fortunate for that. But this gave us these wood specimens in which they were able then to measure the amount of carbon-12 and 14 in the years before the year of this disaster and then the years afterwards, and see that indeed there was a significant shift in the amount of the ratio of carbon-12 and 14 that was changed from this event worldwide as they checked specimens of known age. And so there is that type of event as well as volcanic events that can change the amount of the ratio of carbon-12 to 14. And so other things that can change this ratio are these, that remember we talked about the formation of carbon-14 as high up in the atmosphere, affected by the solar wind. Well, the levels of carbon-14 in cedar tree rings from the years 774 and 5 AD after Christ are much higher than in the years before or after. So there was a tremendous event either involving our sun or involving a nearby supernova, which caused a tremendous increase in the energy released and an increase in the amount of carbon-14 formed in those 2 years. So that, again, this shows that this assumption of unchanging uniform rate of formation in the past simply cannot be sustained, that it is not a viable assumption. Well, in Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 7, we have the issue of the flood. And of course, evolutionists, whether secular or theistic, deny the global Genesis flood, another aspect of uniformitarianism, because that flood wipes out literally 500 million years of evolutionary time. And just as a reminder, why did the flood happen? The purpose of that flood was to judge the incredible increase in sinfulness that had occurred by that time after creation week, 1,656 years after creation. And so that flood was brought about by God to judge the world and to bury all the living things that were not on the ark, that had the breath of life in them as judgment for this sin. So this resulted in a lot of carbon being taken out of circulation from the biomass, from plants and animals, greatly altering the distribution of carbon. And here's a chart showing the distribution of carbon by units, and each unit is 10 to the 9th tons of carbon, 10 to the 9th tons of carbon for just one unit. And so you can see here that there is a huge amount of carbon that was precipitated out of circulation and ended up being in rock of some form, such as carbonates, carbon and oxygen. And indeed also a significant amount into oil and natural gas, coal, and then carbon you see here in the ocean and in peat, as well as in wood and vegetation that we have alive today. But the greatest amount has been taken out of circulation, so that this, I think, would very significantly alter the ratio of carbon-12 to 14. Well, we also have, as I mentioned, the carbon locked up in rocks. So here you see marble, which is simply limestone that has been heated and compressed. And the limestone would be resulting from shells and bones being ground up as part of the flood process and then put down as sedimentary layers of rock, as well as graphite and calcite. So we have a lot of carbon locked up that once upon a time was in circulation. So taking this into account, this can further drastically reduce the carbon-14 age of diamonds and coal to just a few thousand years. So the second assumption that radiometric dating is based upon is that the original amount of parent element was 100% in the sample and that the daughter element was 0% in the sample, and that this is really not a tenable assumption, because the question is, were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? God is speaking to Job. And tell me if you have understanding. There's simply no way to know how much of which elements, which form, carbon-14 or 12, was in a sample when that sample came into being. And that's in Job 38:4. The third assumption is that carbon-14, a dating system based upon, is that the rate of radioactive decay in the past has always been the same as it is today. And we have excellent experimental evidence to show that indeed that is not the case from the RATE project, Radioactivity and the Age of the Earth, done by the Institute for Creation Research and the Creation Research Society. And so here is an example of how to think about this with this sand clock, sand dial, and that as the sand pours through the hourglass, we see a rate of flow at the current time, but we don't know what that rate of flow was through it in the past. And so the radioactive parent atoms are listed at the top, the daughter atoms at the bottom, and we don't know how much time has passed when we come across this hourglass with some of the sand up above and some down below. And so now let's turn to helium diffusion in zircon crystals. Inside these zircon crystals, which are inside of mica or biotite, which is found inside of granite, measurements have been done using two different clocks. One is the diffusion of the helium formed by the decay of uranium down to lead inside the zircon crystals, and measuring the diffusion rate of this helium out of these zircon crystals gives a time of 6,000 years plus or minus 2,000 years. On the other hand, the amount of lead formed by the decay of the uranium says that 1.5 billion years worth of decay has occurred, and that is translated into time only with the assumption of a constant rate of decay. And so the issue is that amount of decay has occurred, but only in a 6,000 year time period. So the only logical outcome of this is that decay rate must have been greatly accelerated in the past, so that 1.5 billion years worth of decay occurred in less than 6,000 years. And so we have this comparison here, and that the rate of decay must have been accelerated at least by a factor of 250,000 times. So the helium that is still in the zircon crystals is there because it has not yet had enough time to diffuse out. Billions of years worth of helium produced by accelerated uranium decay is not found in the atmosphere. The only logical conclusion, again, is that accelerated nuclear decay of uranium atoms in zircon crystals occurred in Earth's recent past. So we come now to a very big question. And that is, remember that the cosmic rays cause the formation of carbon-14 in the atmosphere way high up there. So how did that carbon-14 formed up there get into these diamonds that are formed deep in the Earth's crust? Okay, so how did that carbon-14 formed way up in the stratosphere get down into the crust to be part of diamonds? Well, the answer lies in the geologic column if it is formed by Noah's flood. And that the flood burying plants and animals that were formed deep into the crust there as the earth is reformed, remodeled totally in those miles, the superficial miles of the crust, then explains how that carbon-14 could get from the atmosphere down into the crust and into those diamonds. So let's turn now to spiritual decay and renewal. In Exodus 20:11, we have in the fourth commandment, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the seas and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day." So then he gives the command to be holy and observe the Sabbath. And you also have here that the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So putting these together, we know then that the days of creation week were 24-hour days, as confirmed in the fourth commandment, and that there has been no great amount of time around for man to evolve, but rather that God made man at the beginning, and he made him directly from the elements, from the earth. The word Adam in Hebrew means earth, and that there is no sequence of animals preceding man from which we evolved, and that life came directly from God. And so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and the tree desirable to make one wise, she took of the fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. So here we have this disobedience to the one prohibition that God gave Adam and Eve not to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And so when they did this, there was the judgment for the disobedience. And since then, we have all inherited through Adam that sin nature. And that's why the world is in such terrible shape, not because God isn't here, not because he doesn't care, but because he gives us the freedom to choose to obey him or not. And when we don't, there are consequences, both short-term on this planet and long-term, if we refuse to accept his gift of eternal salvation. And so here in 1 Corinthians, for since by man came death, meaning the disobedience in the Garden of Eden, by man also came the resurrection of the dead, so that that man being Jesus Christ. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all shall be made alive. So that we have that gift of life, both a relationship while we're still alive on this planet, a personal relationship with Christ, as well as being with him in eternity. For if we do choose not to accept that gift of salvation paid for at such a high price on the cross by Christ for us, being on the cross in our place, then God says, okay, you choose not to be with me on earth, so you then choose to not be with me in eternity. Because he's not going to admit people into eternity who still have that sin nature, because he will not allow sin into eternity, or evidence of it. So we have this verse in Psalm, cast your burden on the Lord, and he shall sustain you. He shall never permit the righteous to be moved. So even though we have so many difficulties going on in the world, and they are certainly big in number and in terrible in consequences, we maintain that relationship with the Lord. We have our trust with him. We keep our faith in him, and we will be okay if we have accepted his gift of salvation. So then we have this command here in Colossians. See to it that you are not taken captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends upon human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. So this is a command here saying, don't let empty, hollow, misleading philosophy such as evolution lead you astray and keep you in bondage to sin and to slavery to Satan, but rather allow yourself to be freed by coming to the truth in Scripture and having that relationship with Christ, because he is the foundation of everything we need. So thank you very much, and appreciate your listening.